Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 35, Fight, Fight, Fight. Last time, we talked about New York's political history in the 2 decades after Lyso's rebellion. In the aftermath of the rebellion, New York was divided into two rival factions, the pro- and anti-Lyslarians. Several times, governors were sent to New York with instructions to be conciliatory to both sides, but unfortunately, each governor soon aligned himself with one faction or the other. Benjamin Fletcher, who served from 1692 to 1697, sided with the anti-Lyslarians because that was his best bet at making money through corruption. After he was recalled to England to answer for his actions, his successor, Lord Bellomont, who served from 1698 to 1701, swung in the opposite direction. He was there to fight corruption, and so he wound up siding with the Lyslarians instead. But he died unexpectedly, and then Lord Cornbury, who served from 1702 to 1708, reversed course again, and followed the corrupt anti-Lyslarian policies of Governor Fletcher. It was only with the arrival of William Hunter in 1710 that things finally calmed down. Governor Hunter was competent and well-liked, unlike his predecessors, and he soon put an end to the factionalism by being nice to both sides. So that's where we left things off last time. Governor Hunter was in office and the pro- and anti-Lyslarians had gone away. Today we're going to look at the next two periods of factionalism. The first round of factionalism took place during the 1710s and 1720s. This was a rivalry between the two most powerful economic groups within the colony, the merchants and the big landlords, over who should have to pay more in taxes. The next round of factionalism took place in the 1730s. This time the cause was a personal rivalry between the governor and some of the other leading men of the colony. But first, the fight between the merchants and the landlords. To begin, we need to talk some more about what the economy of New York was like at this time. Most of the American colonies only had one group of rich families. For instance, in New England, all of the rich men were merchants, while in the Chesapeake, all of the rich men were plantation owners. In New York, however, there were two different kinds of rich families with different interests, the merchants and the big landowners. Now, obviously, merchants often used their money to buy land, and landowners were often involved in trade, but families were more focused on one thing or the other. They were distinct enough to form two separate interest groups at the very least. There were four main merchant families in New York around this time. None of them were English. Three were Dutch, the Phillipses, the Van Cortlandts, and the Schuylers, while the fourth, the Delanceys, were founded by a French Protestant. All of these families were intermarried with each other, and they traded in all sorts of goods with all sorts of people, from the Iroquois to Europe to the Caribbean. The landlords I've already talked about a bit. These men were the recipients of those large estates being handed out by Governors Fletcher and Cornbury. Well, they were already rich men beforehand, but the extra land certainly helped. In fact, it made them some of the biggest landowners in the colonies. These were much larger states than the plantations in Virginia, although they were run very differently. Tobacco didn't grow up there and slave labor was ineffective, so instead the land was parceled out to tenant farmers, more like how the nobility in Europe might rent their land out to peasants. And though these estates were huge, much of the land went uncultivated, since not many people wanted to be tenant farmers when they could be freeholders elsewhere. So despite their great size, these manors might have only a few dozen or a few hundred families living on them. And over time the land was subdivided and sold off, so this wasn't really like some permanent old world aristocracy. Some of these manors were given feudal privileges, such as the right to hold courts and to demand corvée labor from their tenants, but in practice those feudal elements didn't amount to much. But these landlords were still powerful men. They basically controlled the government on their lands. Their tenant farmers could vote, but in practice they almost always voted for whoever the landlord supported. 3 of the estates were large enough to have their own delegate in the assembly, and in each of those cases the delegate was always a member of the landowner's family, and the elections were uncontested until the 1760s. The two most politically active landed families were the Morrises, who were English, and the Livingstons, who were Scottish. Both of those families will pop up again several times. So those are the merchants and the landlords. Now what was it that these two groups disagreed about? What makes this split politically important? Well, the main issue was taxation. In New York at this time there were two sorts of taxation. The main type was taxes on imported goods and a few other things like liquor. This tax hurt the merchants most of all. The other less important type of taxation was a property tax, which was only imposed irregularly on an as-needed basis. This tax harmed landowners most of all. And unfortunately for New York, the colony was still in debt, so taxes were going to have to go up one way or another. I think you can see where this is going. The stage was now set for a fight over who was going to foot the government's bills. Would import taxes go up or land taxes? Over the last few decades, the merchants in New York had been growing richer and more influential. They resented the fact that the burden of taxation fell more heavily on them, and now they had enough clout to fight back. So although Governor Hunter had successfully ended the last period of factionalism, already there were new problems brewing. When he arrived in New York, Hunter acted as though he would be friendly to both sides, just like with the pro- and anti-Leislerians, but soon enough he began to side with the landowners. That seems to happen a lot with these governors. They come in planning to be bipartisan, or at least saying they'll be bipartisan, but soon they figure out it's better to side with one faction over the other. Why Hunter sided with the landowners over the merchants isn't exactly clear. At the time, people thought he decided on the basis of a friendship with Lewis Morris, one of the leaders of that faction. Or maybe he just thought that the landowners had better arguments. Or maybe he disdained merchants in general, as being socially inferior to the landed gentry. Or maybe it was that the merchants were mostly Dutch. Who knows? Probably some combination of those things. In any case, within a few years it was clear what the new dividing lines within New York were. As it happened, the merchants controlled the assembly for the first several years of Hunter's administration, and they refused to raise regular tax revenue to pay for the government, knowing that the burden would fall mostly on them. But as a result, the fiscal situation was growing increasingly dire, and Governor Hunter had his back against the wall. So in 1713 he called for new elections, hoping that the next assembly would be more compliant. He and Lewis Morris, that landowner friend of his, led a concerted campaign to win the elections. They published several pamphlets attacking the merchant faction, calling them, quote, a few whimsical, factious, and angry men. They argued that taxes on imported goods were mostly paid by the rich, and that taxes on land would hurt both rich and poor landowners alike. However, that wasn't enough to win the election. Both factions wound up in about the same place as before. So, since they couldn't win at the polls, Hunter and Morris had to hammer out a compromise with the opposition to keep the government running. Hunter would get his revenue, but he agreed to give the assembly much more direct control over how that money was spent going forward. That's a common pattern, you'll notice. With each crisis, the assembly within a colony would use its leverage to get more and more control over finances, greatly increasing its power over time. The rise of colonial legislatures in this way was one of the most notable trends in 18th century America. And because of this self-government, by the time independence came around, the colonists were pretty used to ruling themselves, since the governors had already become weak figures. Anyway, Governor Hunter also agreed to a bill which naturalized foreign-born New Yorkers, whose citizenship had been in doubt. Even with this agreement, most of the merchants still stood in opposition, but enough men defected to get everything passed. In fact, Governor Hunter became so frustrated with how unruly the assembly was that he wrote a satirical play about it, called Androboros, a biographical farce in 3 acts, which was actually the first original play to be printed in America. In this play, instead of an assembly, there's an insane asylum, full of inmates who were very obvious stand-ins for Hunter's political enemies, but with names like Fizzle, Mullagrub, and Doodlesack. These buffoonish inmates are plotting to overthrow the keeper of the insane asylum, very obviously a stand-in for Governor Hunter himself, and replace him with one of their own. First, they smear feces all over a minister's robes and try to blame it on the keeper, and when that doesn't work, they try to lure him into a trap door, only to fall in themselves. In the end, the inmates are defeated in their ludicrous scheming, and the keeper retains his position. Apparently, this play was never performed back in the 1700s, it was only printed. But you may be interested to know that just last year, in 2017, a theater company in New York performed the play for the first time ever. That's one way to keep history alive. Anyway, in between writing plays in verse, Governor Hunter also made sure to further strengthen his relationship with the landowner faction. In addition to his friendship with Lewis Morris, he also became friends with Robert Livingston from the other big landowning family. In 1715, he made sure to give Livingston Manor its own seat in the assembly, which meant that he was one man closer to controlling it. And in fact, in the elections held that next year, a number of prominent merchants lost their seats for whatever reason, which meant that Governor Hunter and the landowners were now in power. Well, in power within the colony at least. But since the merchant faction was now shut out from New York's government, they changed tactics. Rather than try to control the assembly, they instead appealed to the Board of Trade in London, hoping to talk them into blocking some of the governor's new taxes. Basically, they were unhappy with the way their boss was running things, so as a workaround they tried to appeal to their boss's boss. That was the best way to get power. If you had London on your side, you were in charge. But unfortunately for the merchants, two could play at that game, and Governor Hunter had plenty of connections in England himself. After a few years, the Board of Trade backed Governor Hunter with some minor reservations. That actually takes us to the end of Governor Hunter's time in New York. He left the colony in 1719. He'd only served as governor for 9 years, which really wasn't that long of a time considering how slow things moved back then. Anyway, his successor was another Scottish guy, William Burnet. Unfortunately, Burnet was a less skilled politician than Hunter. Although Hunter had sided mostly against the merchants, he was still on friendly terms with them, and he hadn't let factionalism get too out of hand. As far as I can tell, he was widely respected, even by his rivals. Governor Burnet, on the other hand, was not so tactful. Upon arrival, he promptly sided 100% with the landed interests. He didn't feel the need to conciliate the merchants at all. He also broke with precedent by not calling for new elections. Normally when a new governor arrived, he would dissolve the old assembly. But since the 1716 assembly was already dominated by his new allies, Burnet decided to just keep that assembly in place. Why rock the boat? That was a legal thing to do, but it was unpopular. He also removed the last members of the merchant faction from the council as supposed enemies of good government. On top of that, Burnet pursued some unpopular economic policies. For instance, he tried to cut off Albany's trade with Quebec, since he thought that it undermined New York's security. Naturally, Albany didn't like that at all. There were other important issues as well, which I'm not going to get into, such as how the trade with the Indians should be regulated. The point is that Governor Burnet was doing a lot of stuff that was bound to make him unpopular, regardless of whether or not it was a good idea. None of this led to an immediate wave of opposition, but discontent was growing over time. There were special elections to fill vacant seats in the assembly in 1723, 24, and 25, and the merchants won each one of them. Governor Burnet, as undiplomatic as always, tried to challenge the qualifications of one of those men to sit in the assembly by arguing that he wasn't a citizen. But as I mentioned already, 10 years ago Governor Hunter had agreed to a bill which naturalized foreigners, specifically over concerns like this. So the assembly unanimously agreed to seat the man, which must have been a major rebuke to Burnet. By now the opposition to Burnet was becoming more open. Burnet reacted with threats rather than negotiations, which turned opinion against him even more. The merchant faction lobbied the Board of Trade in London to block some of the governor's legislation, this time successfully. Finally, the pressure against Governor Burnet built to the point that he agreed to hold elections for the first new assembly in 11 years. The merchants did very well for themselves, unsurprisingly. But actually it didn't really matter. The year after that, Burnet was removed as governor of New York and made governor of Massachusetts instead. So he was out of New York's hair. Actually, he was soon out of Massachusetts' hair as well, since he died within 2 years of being transferred. The next governor of New York, John Montgomery, wound up siding with the merchant faction, but he also died quickly after only 3 years in office. But in fact, by this point the merchant landowner rivalry was starting to lose its potency, thanks to various changes within the economy. By the 1730s, the economy of New York was becoming complex enough that you could no longer so clearly distinguish between merchants and landowners as separate interest groups. And divisions were opening up within the merchant faction. Previously, the merchants in Albany and New York City had had similar interests. But Albany was shifting away from just trading furs. Now they were shipping a wide variety of local goods, which meant that their interests now aligned more with their landowning neighbors than with the merchants of New York City. So, after less than 20 years, things in New York had once again changed enough that the old factions withered away. But New York never stayed placid for long. That brings us to the Morris-Cosby dispute of the 1730s. Unlike the previous struggle we've just been talking about, which was straightforwardly about two competing economic interests, this dispute began as a minor personal disagreement over salary that escalated into something bigger. The first person in this dispute is Lewis Morris, the big landowner who had been an ally of Governor Hunter. At the moment, he was serving as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. All you really need to know about his personality is that he was very much a politician who loved to be in the thick of partisan fighting. The other figure in the dispute is the new governor, William Cosby. Cosby was another man like Fletcher or Cornbury, in it to make money for himself rather than to govern well. He wasn't qualified for the job, and he only got the appointment thanks to his wife's connections. He also had a rather authoritarian temperament. When he arrived in New York, Governor Cosby quickly sided with the merchant faction which still controlled the assembly. They agreed to raise the money he wanted and to give him a good salary, while he agreed to not call for new elections. Now we come to the minor dispute which sets everything else off. It's a little bit involved, but don't worry about the details, none of this will be on the test. Apparently in New York at this time, for some reason it was standard that when a new governor arrived, the man who had been serving as acting governor in the interim would give to the governor half of the salary he had earned while acting as governor. Governor Cosby asked the former acting governor, Rip Van Dam, to give him a share, but Van Dam refused. Cosby sued Van Dam to collect the money, but he figured that his case wouldn't have a chance if he had to face a jury of unsympathetic New Yorkers. So he tried to come up with a workaround, a way to avoid having his case be tried by a jury. The solution he came up with was to order the New York Supreme Court to sit as a court of exchequer. I won't get into all the legal technicalities here, but basically what that means is he wanted the Supreme Court to hear his case and decide the matter itself, under special rules which bypassed the need for a jury. However, this was a controversial move, and it wasn't clear whether or not Cosby's request was legal. Did the governor have the authority to create a new court on his own authority just like that, or did he need the Assembly's approval? The case was brought before the Supreme Court, which at the time consisted of 3 men, Lewis Morris, the Chief Justice, who came from the landed faction, and 2 other men from the merchant faction. The first issue the court had to decide was whether or not it had the authority to hear the case in the first place. Unsurprisingly, Chief Justice Morris said no, that the Assembly had to approve the creation of any new courts. The governor's authority was insufficient. But the other 2 justices said that yes, the governor did have the authority. A typical partisan split. However, although Morris had been outvoted, he used his position as Chief Justice to simply shut the proceedings down and stop the court from hearing the case any further. To be more precise, he insulted the arguments of his colleagues and then walked out, which prevented anyone from rendering a verdict. Which you would think is a legally questionable tactic, but back then everything was a bit legally dubious given how primitive the courts were. After this, Governor Cosby decided not to press his lawsuit against Van Dam any further. Instead, he escalated the matter in a different way, by removing Morris from the Supreme Court. I suppose things could have ended there, but Morris wasn't the sort of person to take this blow lying down. He decided to take the feud public, by running for a vacant seat in the Assembly. You remember 2 episodes ago when I described an unusually spirited election where both sides had big parades of men on horseback? Well, that was this election. I won't go over the specifics again, I'll just remind you that Morris won. But that wasn't the end of it. Morris's victory was merely the first step in a bigger escalation. What had been a petty dispute among the elite was about to become a partisan dispute among the people at large. Morris and the other leaders of his faction, I'll just call them the Morrisites from now on, the Morrisites decided that public opinion would be a useful weapon against the governor. So they came up with a platform that they thought would have broad appeal. According to the historian Michael Kamen, quote, Lewis Morris Sr. built a coalition of Hudson Valley farmers and New York City artisans, along with small traders there and in Albany. To hold their support, he offered the farmers better roads, cheaper money, and favorable land laws. He offered the petit bourgeois protection against imports, subsidies for local production, and restrictions against peddlers. And for the middle class generally, the burden of direct taxation would be shifted to imposts paid by the larger merchants. End quote. They also focused on good government, with bills to regulate the sheriffs, to regulate the courts, and to increase the power of the Assembly. So this was a broad coalition. It wasn't simply rich versus poor or merchants versus landlords. As usual, there were a lot of things going on at once. In order to spread their message, and just as importantly to attack their enemies, one of the first things the Morrisites did was found a newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal. There was already a newspaper in the colony, but it tended to support the government's point of view, since the guy who printed it was also the official printer for the government, and he didn't want to lose those valuable contracts. But this new newspaper was very much in the hands of the opposition. Morris and his associates started churning out essays. They criticized the government, they criticized the governor. Even the ad page was politicized. There were advertisements for lost animals in which the descriptions of the animals suspiciously resembled notable politicians in the colony. Naturally, this sort of brazen attack on the leadership provoked a backlash. Within 3 months, Governor Cosby was working to get the paper shut down. He even had certain issues of the weekly journal burned in public. And in late 1734, he had the newspaper's printer, John Peter Zenger, charged with libel. Normally this would have been a slam-dunk case, since at this time it was very, very easy for the authorities to convict people for libel. But Zenger had a good lawyer, who made the novel argument the statements couldn't be libelous if they were actually true. Believe it or not, that wasn't the standard approach back then. Even if you told the truth about someone, you could still be convicted for libel, which is part of why it was so easy to get convictions. But not this time. Zenger was acquitted by a jury after only a few minutes of deliberation. Later on, this would be seen as an important precedent for freedom of the press in America, but at the time, maybe the most important impact was that it further hurt Governor Cosby's popularity. That same year, the Morrisites managed to take most of the seats in the New York City Council. They made gains in the assembly as well, but since there had been no general election held in the last 6 years, they weren't able to take it over completely. Everyone agreed that it was time for a new election. Even the assembly itself had unanimously agreed to a statement saying that the current assembly should be dissolved. But if an election were held, Cosby was almost certain to lose out, and so he held back. Since there were no elections to win, the Morrisites decided to attack Cosby by undermining his support in Britain. And so Lewis Morris himself went to London, carrying with him a petition with 34 complaints against the governor, including that he interfered with elections by denying Quakers the vote. The Morrisites had a number of demands as well. Firstly, that Cosby be removed from office or at least have his powers reduced. They also wanted a number of reforms to the electoral system. They wanted elections to the assembly to be held every 3 years or less. They wanted the seats in the assembly to be reapportioned by population. And they wanted to increase the number of officials in New York City and Albany who were elected rather than appointed. And of course there were other non-election related demands as well, but I'm focusing on the election stuff. But like with so many such journeys by colonists back to the mother country, Morris found it hard to get his message across. He spent all of 1735 in London, making very little headway with anything. According to him, Englishmen were, quote, unconcerned at the sufferings of the people in America, and, quote, the most nefarious crime a governor can commit is not by some counted so bad as the crime of complaining of it. In fact, at one point he was more or less offered the governorship of New Jersey as a bribe, just to make him go away. Morris declined. But as it turned out, none of his struggles in London really mattered, since in March that next year, Governor Cosby died of tuberculosis. He'd only been governor 3.5 years. Random deaths really were a big deal back then. It's amazing how often stuff like that happened. So back to New York. Although Cosby was dead, the factionalism continued on a little while longer. This time the issue was who should serve as acting governor. When there was no governor in New York, the eldest member of the council was supposed to be acting governor. Before Cosby had arrived, that man had been Rip Van Dam, the guy who got sued. But Cosby had since removed Van Dam from office, so now the acting governor was supposed to be some other guy named George Clark. Clark was confirmed by the council, but Van Dam claimed that he should be named acting governor instead, although I think his claim was very tenuous at best. But for months on end, the Morrisites agitated on Van Dam's behalf, using their newspaper to undermine acting Governor Clark. After some local elections in New York City were won by supporters of Van Dam, there were enough fears of a popular revolt that Clark moved into the nearby fort for safety along with his family, and he shipped in extra gunpowder to the city just in case. But things calmed down once word reached New York that London had approved Clark as acting governor. That settled the matter immediately. But in fact, this burst of factionalism was coming to an end regardless. Acting Governor Clark agreed to hold new elections, the first in 9 years. The Morrisites finally took control of the assembly, but Clark had signaled to them that he was open to a reconciliation. Most of the Morrisites took him up on the offer, including Lewis Morris himself. They were welcomed back into the fold. After all, there hadn't been that much dividing them in the first place. Clark served as acting governor for 6 years, and during that time, the old party animosities all dissipated. So that was the end of the Morris-Cosby dispute. Not much more than a blip in history, all told. Though there were some changes in New York as a result. For example, the reformers did pass a bill which mandated that elections be held at least once every 7 years, as was the case with the British Parliament. Also, the Assembly began to keep records of which members voted for or against a particular bill. Before, like in Massachusetts, no records had been kept to say how delegates voted. One further step on the road to accountable government. And in general, New York took one more step on the road to full-blown populist politics. The elites found that popular opinion could be a useful weapon, but in order to get popular opinion on your side, you had to offer the people things that they wanted, and you had to learn how to make your message heard. Newspapers, propaganda, parades, etc. And as the factions fought for popular support, the people became politically aware. Once politicians started offering them things, they came to expect it and to demand more and more. Though I don't want to overstate things, the will of the people was still of secondary importance. London mattered much more. And once the dispute between the elite factions went away, so did the need to appeal to the people, so there were no permanent parties set up or anything like that. The people didn't stay fully politicized once their leaders stopped trying to politicize them. By the way, I've been using the word populist a lot lately without ever really defining it. All I mean by it is that the people as a whole are involved. I don't mean populist in the sense of any particular ideology or any particular style of politics, just populist meaning the people in whatever sense. Just so we're clear. Next episode we'll look at the last period of New York's history before the American Revolution, as these storm clouds begin to gather. So join me next time on Early and Often, The History of Elections in America. The podcast is on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or go to the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com for transcripts of every single episode. And if you like the podcast, give it a good review on iTunes. That helps. Thanks for listening.